In 1996, North Korea was in the midst of one of the worst famines experienced by any industrialized nation in modern history, but one idea arose in the high command of the government to remedy this issue. In the harsh and mountainous north, they started a massive campaign to breed mountain goats. Flush with the shrubs they graze upon, it seemed like the perfect way to procure more food for the region. Within 2 years, the goat population tripled, but those shrubs that the goats quickly devoured held together the loose mountain soil during the annual massive rainfalls. Now, without them, the result was massive mudslides, which destroyed much of the only arable land for agriculture and the complete flooding of coal mines. In just 4 years, 5/10 of North Korea's entire population perished. Yet, this is just one small example of a terrible decision in a country that arguably has the most mismanaged economy in modern time. But the North Korea you see on the news today, with its starving citizens and a leadership hell-bent on making nuclear weapons in a desperate last-ditch attempt to maintain power, is largely a product of the last few decades. While North Korea and its tiny economy are now juxtaposed with the incredibly prosperous South Korea, who now has over 70 times the economic output, things used to be dramatically different. In fact, for decades it was the North who maintained the political, economic, technological, and military superiority over the South. North Korea, for a time, was so much better off that it once was pointed to as a shining example of communism in the developing world, and for a brief moment it was the most industrialized and advanced Asian society. From the ideal socialist state to the worst place to live in the world, this is the story of how North Korea became so incredibly poor. For almost all of Korea's existence, it was surrounded by much more powerful nations, and thus had to adapt in the name of self-preservation. There is a famous saying in both Koreas that it is a shrimp among whales, and that the peninsula has been invaded 900 times in the last 2,000 years. For the last 10 centuries, Korea served as a tributary state to the various powerful Chinese dynasties that were by far the most important Asian powers, if not global powers. However, China started a long and slow decline, just as the Europeans started to carve out as much of the world as possible. This gave rise to a new Asian power who sought to rapidly industrialize and modernize its military to be able to fend off the Europeans. By the late 19th century and early 20th century, it was no longer China but Japan that threatened Korea. As Korea could not stand alone, it turned to the Russian Empire, which was looking to expand its own influence in the region. With Russia's help, Korea started to industrialize itself, reform its educational system, and modernize its military. But the Russian Empire was dying, and no event encapsulated this better than its defeat in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. The result of the embarrassing defeat was Japan's uninhibited influence in the region, and Korea was not able to hold off any longer. In 1910, it was now an official colony of the Japanese. From then until 1945, Korea was treated with unimaginable exploitation. However, some important economic development did take place. Northern Korea is incredibly rich in natural resources. According to a Goldman Sachs report, North Korea is sitting atop an estimated $10 trillion worth of mineral deposits. And as such, the Japanese built large-scale mines and processing plants, developed a thriving fertilizer industry, made countless reservoirs and pumping stations to irrigate the fields, and constructed modern power plants. Infrastructure throughout the country was improved to ship the much-needed materials back to Japan to aid in the war effort. But Japan's reign of terror came to an abrupt end. In the very last months of the Second World War, 1.5 million Soviet troops launched a lightning invasion into Manchuria in an effort to snatch up as much land as possible before the capitulation of the Japanese Empire. At the same time, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were erased by the Americans. Weeks later, the largest war in human history was over, but immediately the stage was set for a new, much longer, spanning conflict. Much like the occupation of Germany after the war, Korea was split in half and now existed under polar opposite political ideologies. Their new border then became the new front line of the Cold War. The Soviet Union, in control of the North, quickly appointed Kim Il-sung, a guerrilla fighter in the war who later became an officer in the Soviet Army during the liberation of Korea. He quickly began to build a socialist command economy modeled after and with the help of the Soviet Union. Land was redistributed, those Japanese industries were nationalized, a socialist central bank was created, and a one-party communist state was instituted. Later, all power was vested in Kim Il-sung, who would become more of a god than a ruler to the North Koreans. In the South, the United States created a democratic market economy, although it would function more or less like a brutal dictatorship until the 1980s. The North was blessed with almost all the natural resources, most of the industrial capacity, and 92 of the electrical power generation. In fact, for a brief moment in time, North Korea was by far the most industrialized and urbanized country in Asia in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Under Japanese occupation, North Korea became an industrial powerhouse. But the South had almost all of the prime agricultural land and most of the consumer light industry. The Japanese had made the South into the breadbasket to feed its war efforts. North Korea all of a sudden did not have enough farmlands to feed its people. Faced with its immediate industrial upper hand, but its scarcity of food, and the worry that the South, being backed by the largest economy on Earth, would catch up quickly, Kim Il-sung, combined with the support of the Soviets, and later the Chinese, launched an invasion in 1950. While initially, it seemed like Northern victory was inevitable, United Nations combat forces were able to push the North all the way back to the Chinese border. China, worried about a capitalist foothold on their doorstep, flooded 500,000 soldiers into the Korean peninsula, eventually pushing the front line close to its original borders. The front line ground to a halt, and little progress was made over the coming years. In the face of neither side seeing an ability to advance further, an armistice was signed that is still in effect to this very day, meaning the United States is still technically at war with North Korea. But Kim Il-sung badly miscalculated his war effort, and most of the North's advantage was swept away by the U.S.'s carpet-bombing campaign. In fact, the United States dropped more explosives on North Korea than they had dropped on all nations combined throughout the entirety of the Second World War. Those modern Japanese industries and mines ceased to exist. As historian Charles K. Armstrong put it, North Korea had been virtually destroyed as an industrial society. In the aftermath, Kim set out to finalize the transition into a complete command economy. All farmland and all private property were taken by the state. Markets were outlawed, and almost all freedoms were curtailed, of course, except for those in the ruling class. From then on, all prices, all goods, all funds, and all jobs were to be dictated by the government, exactly the same as in the Soviet Union. But this was even an impossible task for the Soviets to do efficiently, and even more so for the less technologically advanced North Koreans. To make matters even worse, under Japanese occupation, no native Koreans held significant administering positions, meaning there was a severe lack of experience and no real way to produce accurate economic statistics. So when a socialist government was now tasked with deciding every single aspect of the entire economy, there was no hope of it working. Despite this, North Korea, to the surprise of the world, would enter its economic golden age. The North Korean economy from the end of the war until the 1970s grew at a titanic 15 a year, quickly dwarfing the small agrarian economy of the South. But how is it possible that this small nation that was just bombed back into the Stone Age was now able to become one of the fastest growing economies on Earth? The resurgence of North Korea was due in large part to a unique set of circumstances. At the heart of it all was the religious, like dominance of the entire nation by Kim Il-sung. He quickly started to rewrite history, banned religion, persecuted his political opponents, and ultimately became the supreme authority of the land. He warped the Marxist, Leninist theories to his own advantage and to work better with traditional Korean beliefs. This new political dominance was rooted in the ideology of Juche, which roughly translates to self-reliance. Kim argued that the true peak of civilization was contingent upon being freed from the chains of reliance on other nations. The way to achieve this was by placing all trust in him and by carrying out tremendous sacrifice for the state. The ideology heavily borrowed from Korean Confucianism with concepts of hierarchy as the basis of order and social harmony. Coupled with heavy propaganda, the image of the state and Kim himself was warped to resemble that of a family patriarch. With a deeply embedded cultural tradition of family and respecting your elders, it was the perfectly crafted means of social control over the North Koreans. This provided the perfect foundation in which to control and guide the restoration of the nation and economy.